7 young seminary students vanished during a remote retreat in the Montana woods. Their last written words, "We've arrived staying indefinitely." For years, no one heard from them until a mother refused to stop searching and uncovered a trail of psychological control, hidden camps, and a chilling truth whispered only in silence. What really happened deep in those trees, and why did one of them say, "We were never missing"? The morning the van pulled into the gravel lot behind St. Vincent's Community Center was cloaked in a gentle drizzle. Mist clung to the low-hanging branches of the maple trees that lined the parking area, and the hum of early autumn cicadas provided a steady rhythm underneath the quiet voices of departing parents. The 7 young adults gathered in hesitant silence near the building's back entrance, each of them clutching identical black duffel bags, each one bearing a stitched white cross and a name tag. No one really spoke much. There was the occasional polite nod, a half smile, a shuffle of feet on wet gravel. They were strangers, connected only by the fact that each had been recommended for this program by a counselor, a priest, or, most often, a worried family member who had grown tired of the unpredictable moods, the late-night anxiety attacks, the substance relapses, the unexplained crying jags, or the endless, numbing withdrawal. Among them was Eva Rodriguez, 22, whose social media blackout 3 months ago had been her mother's final straw. Then there was Jaden, who refused to share a last name and rarely spoke above a whisper. Caleb, tall and withdrawn, kept a notebook tucked into his jacket. His therapist had written in the referral that he hadn't spoken a full sentence since February. They had all been told the same thing, that this wasn't a boot camp, wasn't a rehab, wasn't punishment. It was a retreat, a spiritual recentering, grounded in the wilderness and silence, a place where they would learn to listen again, to breathe, to belong. The program had a name, Via Lucis, Latin for the Way of Light, and it had a leader, Brother Owen Merritt. When he finally arrived, stepping out of the center's side door and pulling the hood of his long olive-green raincoat over his head, the group instinctively turned toward him, as if gravity had shifted and he was now the axis of their collective unease. Owen looked to be in his mid-50s, weathered and lean, with sharp cheekbones and eyes like hammered steel. His presence was disarming, not warm, not cold, just deliberate. He carried no suitcase, no umbrella, no clipboard, only a leather-bound book clutched in one hand and a silver crucifix tucked into his belt. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and resonant, like something built for cathedral walls. "Thank you all for coming. You've made the first and hardest step. You showed up." No one responded, but no one turned away either. He smiled faintly. "Before we leave, I'll ask you to turn off your phones and leave them here with Sister Marla inside. This place we're going, Eagle's Rest, isn't for distractions. No calls, no screens, no updates, just silence, truth, and healing." That's all. One by one they obeyed, even Jaden. Sister Marla, a gentle woman in her 60s with snowy white hair and eyes that held 1,000 sleepless nights, took their phones and zipped them into a safe bolted to the floor. "No signal up there anyway," she murmured to Eva, who lingered just a moment longer before handing over her device. No signal up there shut with a solid click. No one asked where they were going exactly. They only knew it was in Montana, somewhere remote, and that they'd be gone for 3 weeks. Maybe longer. As the van pulled onto the highway and the city fell away behind them, Eva stared out the window at the smudged blur of strip malls and traffic lights and wondered if her mother was crying right now, or relieved, or both. Across from her, Jaden fidgeted with the zipper on his hoodie, while Caleb silently traced shapes into the fogged window with his fingertip. The others remained similarly silent, as if some unwritten pact had formed during those first few minutes of travel. Don't speak unless absolutely necessary. Brother Owen didn't say much during the drive. Occasionally he'd quote a line from Scripture, never loudly, never for attention, just soft mutterings about light and darkness, about wilderness and finding one's path. It was strange, but not threatening, not yet. They stopped once for gas and sandwiches, and then continued onward, the road narrowing and the forests thickening, until there were no more cell towers or gas stations, just tall pine trees and signs warning of bears. Eventually, the paved road gave way to gravel, and the van climbed up a winding path that coiled like a serpent around the hills. At the crest of one such bend, Eagle's Rest appeared, an old lodge half swallowed by trees, with its wooden planks faded gray and a small stone chapel standing quietly beside it. The lodge looked abandoned but solid. There were no other cars in sight, no signs of life beyond them, just wilderness. Owen stepped out first. "We've arrived," he said. The wind rustled the trees around them, as if affirming the statement, "This place has been here longer than any of us. It has seen generations pass through its halls. It offers no comfort." But it offers truth. The group filed out slowly. As Eva stepped onto the gravel, her boot crunching softly, she felt a strange pull in her stomach, not fear exactly, but something adjacent. Unease, maybe, like walking into a house that's too quiet. She glanced at Caleb, who met her gaze briefly before lowering his eyes again. Inside the lodge, each of them was assigned a room, simple quarters with bunk beds, wool blankets, and small handwritten notes on each pillow. "You are not alone." There was no TV, no mirrors, no clock, just a small window and a heavy wooden door. That first night, they sat in the chapel as Owen lit a single candle and told them, "Here we leave the world behind. No names, no past, just the now." He then handed out journals, blank, unlined, with leather cover. "Write. Speak only when required. Listen to the silence. And remember, some doors must stay closed. Not everything wants to be found." No one slept well. The forest was too loud. The silence was too thick. And somewhere deep inside each of them, the question hung, unspoken but sharp. What exactly had they come here to find? The days at Eagle's Rest quickly dissolved into a rhythm that felt both structured and vaguely unreal. Each morning began with the ringing of a small brass bell outside the lodge. The sound was soft, yet carried eerily well through the pine-laced air. They rose in silence, ate plain breakfasts, usually oats and fruit, and gathered in the chapel for scripture reading and journaling. 2 hours later, Owen never raised his voice, never commanded in the traditional sense. Yet his presence filled every space they entered. His rules were not written down, but everyone followed them. Silence was expected unless directly addressed. No one was to venture beyond the perimeter trails marked with white stones. Journals were to be written in daily and left on the chapel altar each night. The first time Eva forgot hers in her room, she found it waiting on her pillow the next evening. The last page dog-eared. No explanation, no scolding, just a silent reminder that someone was watching. By the fourth day, the forest had grown oppressive. Dense fog had rolled in and lingered, making the world outside the lodge feel distant, unreachable. There were no working clocks, no electricity except for a single generator that powered the kitchen for 2 hours each evening. The group had started to shift subtly. They moved more slowly, spoke even less than before, and took to copying quotes from Scripture or Owen's sermons into their journals, like students trying to impress a distant teacher. On the 5th night, Brother Owen told them, "Out there," he gestured toward the woods, "is noise. Here we are learning to hear." Eva scribbled it into her journal without thinking. It was Jaden who first noticed something was wrong. After dinner, he walked toward the tool shed by the back fence to retrieve firewood, but the door was chained shut. The lock was new, shiny, untouched by rain, and clearly not meant to be opened by anyone but Owen. When he mentioned it in passing to Rory, the youngest of the group, she went quiet and then whispered, "I think he's hiding something in there." Jaden didn't reply, but the look in his eyes changed. On day 8, the lodge's only emergency radio vanished. It had been mounted by the kitchen window since the beginning, dusty and unused, but reassuring. Now there was only a clean square of wall where it had hung. When Caleb asked about it, Owen replied simply, "It was never necessary." He smiled afterward, but no one smiled back. That night, Eva woke to a low, vibrating hum. She rose from her cot and walked toward the hallway, drawn to the faint glow seeping beneath the chapel door. Through the narrow crack she saw Owen seated alone before the altar, hands clasped over an open journal, not his own, but one of theirs. A small candle flickered beside him. She stepped back quietly, but something tightened in her chest. The next morning, Caleb's journal was missing from the altar. He said nothing, but his hands trembled during breakfast. 3 days later, the van was gone. It had sat parked beneath the sloped hill near the stone chapel, mud still dried on its tires from the drive up, like a lifeline they hadn't dared touch. Then, one afternoon, after a long session of mindful stillness near the lake, they returned to find the vehicle missing. When Rory asked where it had gone, Owen responded, "The world comes back only when you're ready. Some doors don't need to open too soon." Jaden stared at him as if trying to determine whether the man was serious or playing some elaborate joke, but Owen's expression remained calm, as always. That evening, Rory attempted to use her old iPod Touch, claiming she'd hidden it in the sole of her boot. It wouldn't turn on. Jaden tried to find the satellite dish that had been mentioned in the welcome brochure, the one that supposedly relayed weather info to the retreat's kitchen. It too was gone. No cables, no trace. Just empty mounts on the roof where something had once been bolted down. The mood turned from contemplative to heavy. Meals were quieter. Eyes darted more often toward the tree line. One morning, Eva asked Owen when they'd be returning. He didn't answer at first. Then finally, he turned to her and said, "You've already arrived. Why are you still looking for a way back?" That afternoon, Caleb snapped, he refused to enter the chapel. The following morning, he was gone. Not a trace in his bunk, no footprints leading into the woods. Just his journal, lying neatly closed on the altar, even though he hadn't entered the chapel the night before. Owen said nothing about it. No one did. When Eve opened Caleb's journal that night, violating one of Owen's unspoken rules, she found the last page filled with frantic scribbles. Not words, just spirals. Circles layered atop one another like a maze without an exit. But beneath that, in shaky penmanship, were 5 words. He said we must stay. It was Rory who discovered the main logbook in the chapel a few days later, behind a loose panel in the altar's base. The book was supposed to record group activities, meals, prayer sessions, basic logs in case of emergencies. Most of the pages were filled with mundane entries, weather notes, meal counts, scripture selections. But the final entry chilled her. Dated 2 days ago, the note read, "Simply well." The signature was a strange mix of block letters and cursive, not matching any of the group's handwriting. But Eva, after studying it carefully, realized it resembled Owen's signature from a program pamphlet she had once seen weeks before. The strange part? It wasn't his current handwriting. It was from years ago, when he was still part of the public church system before his disciplinary sabbatical. That night, Eva couldn't sleep. Her dreams blurred between real and imagined, images of thick fog swallowing the lodge, of whispers rising from the woods, of pages fluttering in windless air. When she awoke, the chapel candle was already lit. Owen sat in front of the altar once more, eyes closed, lips moving. And though his voice was too soft to understand, Eva thought she heard it anyway. "They've arrived. They're listening now." She stepped back, heart hammering, the air suddenly too thin. A single crow shrieked outside, sharp and sudden, and just beyond the misted window she thought she saw someone standing near the tree line, watching, waiting. It took 3 more weeks before anyone officially realized the group hadn't returned. Lydia Hall, Eva's mother, had expected a letter, a call, or even just a postcard by the 15th day. When nothing came, she phoned St. Vincent's Community Center, the location where she had dropped Eva off nearly a month ago. The receptionist hesitated, then explained that the Via Luces retreat was not administered by the center itself, but merely used its parking lot as a meeting point. Concerned, Lydia called the local sheriff's office, who escalated the report to the Montana State Police. Within 72 hours, a search party was dispatched into the heavily forested region surrounding the coordinates listed on the tweet's brisket. What they found at Eagle's Rest was not what anyone expected. The lodge stood silent, sun-bleached and skeletal, as though untouched for years. The doors creaked on rusted hinges. The interior smelled of rot and ash, and cobwebs laced the rafters in thick sheets. There were no dishes in the sink, no bedding on the cots, no food supplies. The chapel was cold and dust-covered, its altar split diagonally from an apparent lightning strike. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of abandonment, one thing felt recent: a broken phone, half buried under pine needles near the side entrance. Its screen was shattered, casing cracked, but the SD card inside had survived. It was catalogued and examined in a forensics lab 3 days later, where technicians recovered a 6-second audio file. The voice, fragile, uncertain, belonged to a young woman. In the background, there was the subtle murmur of wind through trees, then a soft intake of breath. He said we must. Authorities assumed at first that a sudden weather event or animal attack had forced the group into the forest, or worse. But the lack of blood, damage, or signs of panic contradicted such theories. Rangers noted that the trails surrounding the lodge had not been recently used, no broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth. It was as if the forest itself had sealed over any evidence. The only personal effects found were 7 journals stacked neatly inside a rusted filing cabinet in the chapel's back room. Each journal was incomplete, the entries stopping abruptly after day 12. Most pages were mundane, thoughts about nature, quotes from Owen, reflections about silence, but a few entries stood out. In Eva's journal, the last thing she had written was, "He says the world lies. Only here, only now, can we be true." Caleb's journal contained only blacked-out words and scratch marks across the bottom half of the page. Rory's final line read simply, "Don't follow us." Still, there was no sign of struggle, no evidence that any of them had left by foot or vehicle. The van itself was never recovered, as if it had vanished along with them. When questioned, Sister Marla, who had taken the group's phones, was cooperative but confused. She claimed she hadn't seen Brother Owen since the morning of their departure and was unaware that the retreat was meant to last longer than 3 weeks. When pressed about the organization running Via Lucis, she provided a contact file, a single manila folder containing photocopies of consent forms signed by each participant, and a schedule printed on old church letterhead. The problem? The letterhead was outdated by nearly a decade, and the name Brother Owen Merritt didn't appear on any official documents. Alarmed, authorities subpoenaed the diocese archives for more information. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The name Via Lucis had appeared once before, associated with a now-defunct monastic healing program in Arizona in 2009, which had shut down after a participant was hospitalized for dehydration and psychosis. The supervising cleric in that case was Owen Merritt, whose license had been suspended indefinitely due to psychological manipulation under the guise of spiritual discipline. No charges were filed, but he had disappeared from church records entirely in the years following. There were no employment records, no mailing addresses, no tax filings under his name. It was as though he had erased himself. Investigators cross-checked this information with the center's referral records. Each of the 7 missing young adults had been recommended through different mental health channels, private therapists, church groups, even parole boards. All roads, it turned out, led to a single email address, lucisfieldguide@protonmail.com. But the address had been deactivated just 4 days after the group's arrival at the lodge. Lydia, unwilling to let the case fade into bureaucratic obscurity, began her own research. She drove to the last known location of Brother Owen's Arizona retreat, now a gutted barn beside a collapsed shrine. On the back of one wall, beneath graffiti and soot, someone had etched into the wood, "We stay by choice. The truth is the fire." She snapped a photo and sent it to the lead investigator, who had grown increasingly skeptical about pursuing dead leads. Meanwhile, forensic analysts revisited the broken phone, extracting metadata from the voice memo. The timestamp placed it 6 days after the group's scheduled return. The file had been saved but never played. Even stranger, the GPS data placed its origin point 5 miles east of Eagle's Rest, deep into the woods where no trails existed. By week 6, the investigation began to stall. With no bodies, no witnesses, and no further evidence, the authorities were forced to classify the incident as a missing persons event with unresolved circumstances. A small shrine formed near the trailhead, where relatives of the missing came to leave candles, photographs, rosaries, and handwritten letters. News crews visited briefly, capturing aerial shots of the abandoned lodge before turning their attention elsewhere. But Lydia remained. She rented a small cabin 20 minutes from the site and began walking the forest each day at dawn. One morning, in the thick silence of the fog, she found a strip of faded cloth snagged on a branch, black, worn thin, and stitched with a frayed white cross. It could have belonged to any number of people, but her heart told her it was Ava's. She tucked it into her coat pocket and pressed on. That evening, back in the cabin, she opened the file folder again. She stared at the consent forms, rereading the lines she'd already memorized. One paragraph stood out in a different light now. By signing, I willingly submit to the authority and structure of Via Lucas, and accept that my journey will not be bound by time or conventional metrics of progress. I understand this retreat may result in a transformation that cannot be undone. Her hands trembled as she flipped the final page. The bottom of the last form, the space for supervising clergy, had been signed in heavy black ink. It was a name, but barely legible, scrawled as if in haste or fatigue. She had seen that signature before, once on a pamphlet, once inside a journal. It was not Owen Merritt exactly, it was something older, something rewritten. Something that, for Lydia Hall, surrender was never an option. Even as news cycles moved on and headlines faded, even as law enforcement reduced their active investigation to an occasional phone call or a quarterly email update, Lydia remained fixed in the slow orbit of a mother's instinct. Eva was not gone. She had not vanished. She had been led away, misguided perhaps, but not lost. Lydia's days blurred into ritual. Each morning began with the same route through the woods, the same pair of worn hiking boots, the same thermos of coffee growing colder in her pack. She mapped every turn, marked every tree, journaled every deviation in the path, even if it led nowhere. But it was on a rain-slicked evening in early November, back at the cabin she'd rented, near the retreat site, that she stumbled upon something that cracked the silence wide open. She had taken to rereading every piece of correspondence Eva had ever written. The old birthday cards, school essays, even grocery lists, desperate to hear her daughter's voice in any form. One letter, folded between the pages of a book Lydia hadn't opened in years, bore no date and no envelope. It was addressed not to Lydia, but to herself, as if Eva had written it as a mirror, a reflection. The letter spoke of longing, of anger, of exhaustion, but near the end there was one chilling sentence. Brother Owen said if we truly understood, we wouldn't want to come back. Lydia sat with that line for a long time, heart thudding, fingers gripping the paper like it might dissolve. She read it again and again until the words imprints behind her eyes. That sentence wasn't metaphor, it was instruction, a warning, or worse, a vow. Compelled by a sudden surge of clarity, Lydia decided to dig deeper. She remembered a passing detail from a volunteer at the diocesan archive, an old address listed on an outdated newsletter from when Brother Owen had been part of the church in New Mexico. The town was called Trevallis, barely a speck on the map, near the Colorado border. After 3 calls and one hesitant confirmation from a librarian, Lydia packed a bag and drove through the night, snow beginning to dust the shoulders of the road by the time she reached the outskirts of the forgotten town. Trevallis was a place that time had quietly abandoned. 1 gas station, 2 diners, and a narrow main street where most windows had been boarded up. But the bookstore stood. It was called A Word in the Wilderness. The letters faded on the wooden sign, some missing entirely. The bell above the door rang as she entered, startling a thin man behind the counter who looked up from his newspaper with wary curiosity. Lydia explained herself quickly, firmly. She was not a journalist, she said, not police, just a mother. A name brought her here, Owen Merritt. The man paused, then nodded slowly. He used to come in every Thursday, he said, never bought anything, just sat in the back with a journal. Just talk much, seemed intense. Lydia asked if she could see the space he used. The man hesitated, then pointed to a dusty, reading nook behind a sagging bookshelf. Left a few things behind when he stopped showing up. The corner was dim, lit only by slanted morning light through cracked blinds. A small table, a worn armchair, and beside it a forgotten crate, sealed with aged masking tape. Lydia's fingers trembled as she peeled it open. Inside were 6 tattered notebooks, each filled with dense, cramped handwriting. The covers bore no titles, just Roman numerals and dates. The earliest dated back 12 years. She opened the first one and began to read. It was unmistakably his voice, calm, calculating, righteous. The entries detailed the practice, as he called it, structured fasts, sensory deprivation experiments, spiritual silence beyond language. He spoke of his subjects, always in plural, but never by name. They must unmake the self before anything true can be received. Another entry. Day 27. Participant expressed panic during blackout ritual, resisted the stillness. We will repeat the exercise until he surrenders. Lydia's breath caught as she read, flipping through page after page of escalating control cloaked in theological language. In Journal Or, a section was underlined twice in red pencil. To test absolute faith, we must remove the illusion of return. Only when departure is impossible can trust become real. That single sentence pulsed in her skull like a drumbeat. Toward the end of the 6th notebook, a page had been torn out. The stubs at the spine were fresh compared to the yellowed edges, but the page after the missing one bore a list, a crude table with names. She scanned the list. Underneath the heading, Voluntaries, Phase Finalists, 6 initials had been written, ERJCRWNS-M. Eva Rodriguez, Jaden, Caleb, Ori, Naomi. Marcus. 7 total, but only 6 listed. The last line read, +1, voluntary observation only. Lydia stared at the notation, a chill crawling beneath her skin. One among them hadn't volunteered. Someone had been brought to observe what full surrender looked like from the outside. Heart pounding, she snapped photos of every relevant page and carefully returned the notebooks to their crate. As she turned to leave, she noticed a torn index card taped to the underside of the table. On it, in the same angular script, were coordinates, hand-hilted but legible. Not the same as Eagle's Rest, a different location, farther west, deeper into Montana's wilderness. It wasn't labeled, no note of what it marked, but beneath the numbers, one word was scrawled in all caps, beneath. She thanked the shopkeeper and left without explaining what she had found. As she sat behind the wheel of her rental, snow melting slowly across the windshield, Lydia opened her phone and input the coordinates. The satellite view showed dense forest, no buildings, no roads, just a dark patch of trees hemmed in by elevation markers. But something caught her eye, a faint circular clearing, unnatural in shape, like a flattened ring inside the trees. Lydia closed her eyes and whispered Eva's name. Then she started the car, tires crunching over the wet gravel as she turned back toward the mountains. Behind her, the bookstore's sign creaked in the wind. Inside, dust began to settle again on the journals. But in Lydia's hands, one page remained open, the ink still fresh in her memory, the words etched into her resolve. Only when departure is impossible. 6 years had passed since Lydia Hall last saw her daughter's handwriting in that faded bookstore in Tres Valles. 6 long years of unanswered letters, of weathered search permits, of quiet forest vigils that blurred into ritual more than hope. The media had moved on, the case cold and forgotten, except for a few stuffered forums and one printed photo still pinned above a dusty sheriff's desk in Gallatin County. Lydia had returned to Eagle's Rest every autumn, walking the same looping trails, whispering Eva's name into empty trees, watching the canopy change with the seasons like it too was waiting. But she wasn't the only one keeping the memory alive. In early September of the 6th year, a ranger named Glenn Matvis, patrolling a lesser-used path near the northwestern stretch of Glacier National Park, stumbled out of the woods 3 hours late, dehydrated and visibly shaken. His supervisor noted his incoherence, the way he kept looking over his shoulder, insisting he hadn't been alone out there. Later, after rehydration and rest, he gave a statement that rippled quietly through the lower community. "I got turned around, off the lower ridge. I think I was circling too close to the basin. Around dusk, I saw someone standing behind the ferns near the stream bed. A young girl, teenager maybe, just watching me. She was wearing, like a robe, one of those old-fashioned ones. Looked like something from a monastery. She didn't speak, she just stared. Then she was gone." Authorities didn't give it much weight at first. Montana forests were vast, and sightings of figure in the woods weren't uncommon, especially from fat-agassed hikers or rangers caught in twilight disorientation. But Glenn was not the type prone to hallucinations, and what made the detail harder to dismiss was his insistence on the robe. Dark gray, no zipper, no logos, just a cord around the waist, like something religious. That description struck an eerie chord with one detective still working the Hall case on her own time, Renee Malin, a mother herself. She reopened the old file, reread the notes about Via Lucas, the journals, the drawings of simple robes and stitched crosses. She called Lydia. A moment Lydia heard the ranger's quote, her hand clenched so tightly around the phone it left a bruise. She drove north that same evening, arriving by sunrise. Together with Detective Malin and a small volunteer team equipped with GPS equipment, they mapped the terrain described by Glenn. Dense bramble marked the boundary between the old lodge clearing and the deeper, untracked woods beyond the basin. Terrain no official search had covered extensively. They pushed deeper for 2 days. On the third, just past the ridge where tree roots warped the earth like ribs, pressing upward, they found something odd, a cluster of stones arranged in a half circle, clearly not natural. Beneath one of the larger rocks, half buried by moss, a metal ring protruded. It was a handle. Lydia was the first to recognize what it might be. "It's not a hatch," she said softly. "It's a cellar." They cleared away the overgrowth with gloved hands, revealing a rectangular iron door with hinges so rusted it looked fossilized. When they forced it open, a blast of cold air poured out, damp, earthy, and faintly metallic. A wooden staircase descended into the dark. Flashlights flicked on. They went down. What they discovered was neither a survival shelter nor a storage space. It was a constructed space, deliberate and lived in. The walls were lined with insulation, not modern, but enough to trap warmth. There were 7 sleeping mats, stacked with wool blankets. On a central table lay a circle of ceramic cups arranged around a small candle holder. Wax residue pooled in its center. A copy of the New Testament sat beside the cups, its pages warped from humidity. There were tins of dried food, mostly beans and oats, and hand-labeled jars with dates scratched into them in fading ink. But the most jarring item was a map, pinned to a wooden beam with a rusted nail. It was hand-drawn, depicting the surrounding forest with concentric circles spreading outward from the lodge. Along one edge of the map was a series of marks, second initials, like the ones Lydia had seen in the journals years ago. But now, next to each set of initials, was a tally. Not numbers, just single lines, like days counted in confinement. Eva's initials, E.R., had more than 30 lines beside them. Detective Malin took photos while Lydia moved with near-reverent caution. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by a leaning cabinet, she noticed a scrap of fabric pinned to the wall. It was the same dark gray material Glenn had described. Stitched at the bottom corner was a familiar white cross. Lydia touched it, whispering her daughter's name. There was no doubt now, some had lived here recently. The floor held scattered debris, crumbs, torn paper, an empty candle tin still warm to the touch. In the corner, beneath a pile of folded canvas, a small tin box contained handwritten slips, each one written on rough parchment with lines of scripture or half-verses, some rewritten into strange configuration. "The meek shall remain." One note, ink faded and smeared, bore only a single sentence. "We are beneath the world now. We see it clearly from below." As the team photographed the space and prepared to report the findings, Lydia stepped outside into the clearing, her breath visible in the sudden cold. The sky above was overcast, the trees unmoving, as if the forest itself had frozen in time. Something inside her shifted, not quite hope, not quite dread. She had feared she'd never find a trace again, and now she had found a chamber, still warm from youth, a row of conditions marked as though tracking time. Someone was still out here. One of them. Later that night, as the team reviewed the findings in their field tent, a volunteer named Asha reviewed drone footage from earlier that morning. On one frame, barely visible between the trees, a pale blur could be seen standing still behind a ridge. It was gone in the next frame. They enlarged it, no detail, no face, but a silhouette unmistakably human, feel unmoving, watching. Lydia stared at the screen for a long time. "It's her," she said. No one responded. Back at the shelter, one of the team members who had stayed behind reported that the robe pinned to the wall had gone missing. They searched the perimeter. No footprints, no sound, just the forest and the sense that someone had been much closer than they thought. The discovery of the underground shelter had changed everything. What had once been a cold case, fading into legend, now pulsed again with urgency and quiet dread. After securing the site, the forensic team performed a sweep that uncovered a false panel behind the sleeping mats, revealing a narrow alcove lined with milk crates filled with old cassette tapes, handwritten lesson plans, laminated index cards, and 2 camcorders, one broken, one still functional. The files on the working device were minimal, but beside it sat a small metal box filled with mini DV tapes, each labeled in careful black handwriting. Session 1, Entry, Day 3, Revelation. Week 2 described so that contracts most fertilized, and teams of vapor watched in silence as the veil over Via Lucis was finally lifted. The first tape began with poor audio and a wide shot of what appeared to be the chapel at Eagle's Rest. 7 figures sat cross-legged on the floor in a half circle, facing a single flickering candle. Brother Owen stood at the head of the room, barefoot, his long robe brushing the stone floor. His voice, though distorted by the tape's age, was calm and deliberate. He walked slowly around the circle, placing an object, a smooth white stone, before each participant. These are your thoughts, solid, familiar, held in the hand. But they are not you. One of the girls, Lydia was sure it was Ava, shifted slightly as he spoke. No one else moved. He continued, "We'll place them here." He gestured toward a bowl in the center of the circle, "and watch them disappear. So will your identities." What followed over several recordings was not violence, not screaming or confinement, but something quieter, more dangerous. Each session layered language with ritual, repetition with isolation. Exercises involved blindfolded journaling for hours, standing still in silence, while the others read prepared truth statements aloud. Daily renunciations of individual names and histories. In one particularly haunting video, the group stood in the rain, arms outstretched, repeating in unison, "The world lies, the world lies, the world lies." Another tape showed Brother Owen guiding a reflection fast, in which no one was permitted to speak, gesture, or write for 3 full days. Each time a participant broke the rule, they were required to restart the fast from the beginning. In his instructional sessions, part lecture, part sermon, Owen wove spiritual language with clinical precision. "We're not punishing," he said in one video. "We're revealing. All suffering comes from illusion, the illusion of choice, of return, of self." He spoke often about the illusion of return, a phrase that began to appear in the group's handwritten notes as well. Lydia, watching these videos, felt her stomach knot into something that would not unwind. There was no shouting, no visible force, but what she saw was no less disturbing. These young adults, her daughter among them, had not been chained. They had been slowly unwound, reshaped by a system so subtle that they likely never recognized it happening. And then came the tape that no one expected. The date scribbled on the label was just 2 weeks after the group's arrival. The video opened on Brother Owen standing alone in the chapel, camera positioned on a tripod. He looked directly into the lens, his expression softer than usual. "By now," he said, "you've seen that they're ready. You've seen what belief looks like when stripped of context." He paused, taking a breath. "There's something I need to say, not for the critics, not for the families, but for the record, so that no one later says they didn't know." He stepped closer to the camera, voice lower now. "No one was forced. No one was misled. They chose this." He nodded slowly, almost reverently. Every one of them was given the door, and they closed it behind themselves. Detective Mallon stopped the video, her hand trembling. Action. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. Lydia didn't respond. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, frozen on Owen's face, studying every shadow for signs of doubt or manipulation. But there were none. He believed what he said. That was the most terrifying part. In the final tape, which appeared to have been recorded with a handheld camcorder, the group sat around a small fire deep in the forest, faces lit by flickering orange. The camera panned slowly, stopping momentarily on each of them. Caleb smiled faintly. Rory's eyes were closed. Jaden held a small wooden figure in his hands. And then the camera lingered on Eva. She looked directly into the lens for several seconds, her face unreadable. Then she spoke, quietly. "We are not missing. We are awake now." The camera panned away before shutting off. Later that evening, back at the field tent, Lydia replayed that final clip again and again, focusing on the way Eva had said those words, not robotic, not coerced, certain, as if she had found something Lydia could not see, something that frightened her. Detective Malin cataloged the evidence, marked the recordings, and began preparing a report that would reopen the federal case. But the question lingered among everyone involved. If they had truly chosen to stay, if there had been no physical chains, no walls, what responsibility could law enforcement claim? What line had been crossed, and by whom? Lydia stared at the photos of the shelter wall, of the robe, of the initials and tallies, and the empty mats. She thought of the sentence in the journal, "We are beneath the world now." And the longer she thought, the more it began to feel true. That Eva hadn't disappeared, not really. She had crossed into something, voluntarily or not, that made returning impossible. And someone somewhere was still watching those tapes, still waiting for the final tally to be complete. The tapes, the journals, the robe, and the hidden shelter had reignited attention in the case, and for the first time in years, federal agents were fully engaged again. Lydia had remained at the edge of the investigation, not as a bystander, but as a quiet force behind every request for re-examination. The story of the Montana Seven, as the media began calling them again, became a second wave of national fascination. New experts were brought in, cult psychologists, religious scholars, forensic linguists, each dissecting every line Brother Owen had recorded, every symbol scrawled in the journals, searching for motive, method, or meaning. Then, out of nowhere, came a break that no one expected. In a routine DMV audit of state ID renewals in Idaho, a clerk flagged a minor discrepancy in the Social Security number and name attached to a woman's renewal form. Her photo matched no database of missing persons, but when the image was cross-sected against the case file for the Eagles Rest disappearances, it hit a 94% facial recognition match for Rory Whitman, the youngest of the original seven. She was now going by the name Eliza Brandt, living in a small town outside Boise, working part-time at a florist and renting a studio above a bakery. She had no criminal record, no known family in the area, and had filed taxes regularly for the past 4 years. Her paper trail began roughly 3 years after the original disappearance. When agents approached her, she did not run. She did not act confused or defensive. She opened the door, looked directly at the lead officer, and asked calmly, "Is this about the others?" They brought her in for questioning the next morning. Lydia flew out immediately. The room was sterile, clean, monitored from behind a one-way mirror. Eliza, Rory, sat straight in her chair, hair longer now, darker, pulled back simply. Her voice was measured, calm, firm. When asked about Eagles Rest, about Brother Owen, about the underground shelter, she declined to answer. No tears, no anger, just stillness. "I'm not here to revisit that chapter," she said. "I have no legal charges against me, and I won't participate in any narrative that rewrites what we chose." Agents pushed harder. They showed her photos, Eva's journal, the robe, the tally marks. Eliza looked at each carefully but made no comment. They asked about the shelter, about whether the others were alive. She said nothing. Finally, after 3 hours of silence, one agent, frustrated, asked why she wouldn't even confirm her identity. Eliza leaned forward slightly and said without emotion, "You're asking the wrong questions. We were never missing, we were found. You can't lose what has already been released." Detective Malin reviewed the footage later with Lydia in a quiet conference room. They replayed that line several times. "We were found." Lydia clutched Eva's old photo tightly in her lap. "She doesn't look like a prisoner," Malin whispered. But he didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, searching for some flicker of the girl who had once giggled in church parking lots and left post-it notes on the fridge. But Eliza Rory was not that girl anymore. She was something else, transformed. Before being released, Eliza signed a formal statement declining to press charges against anyone and asserting that her disappearance had been entirely voluntary and spiritually motivated. She added one final note, written by hand in black letters. "We are freed." When asked where the others were, she smiled slightly and said, "Not everyone chose to return." That doesn't make them lost. She returned to her studio apartment the same day. By the time officials returned later with a court order to collect further evidence, she was gone. The apartment had been cleared, no trace left behind. Her landlord said she'd paid 6 months in advance and left a note, "Thank you for the peace." Media coverage exploded after that. Talk shows debated whether she was brainwashed or enlightened. Panels argued over the legality of self-imposed disappearance. Journalists descended on the bakery she'd lived above, interviewing neighbors who only knew her as quiet, kind, soft-spoken, but none could say where she'd gone. Her bank account closed, her phone line disconnected. Surveillance footage from the following morning showed a hooded figure boarding a northbound bus. Destination unknown. The reemergence of one member sparked a resurgence in public interest. Tips began pouring in, sightings, rumors, possible trails. Some were obvious hoaxes, others disturbingly plausible. But none led to more survivors. Lydia returned to Montana, to the woods, to the hollow silence of Eagle's Rest. One evening she sat alone beside the stream where the shelter had been found. She reread the handwritten quote Eliza had left. "We are freed." The words didn't feel like closure, they felt like doctrine. Later that night, as the wind picked up and the moon drifted high, 7 figures standing in a small envelope she'd received anonymously at her motel. Inside was a single photo, black and white, slightly out of focus. 7 figures standing in a clearing, faces turned away from the camera, robes simple and matching. They were holding hands. A candle burned at their center. On the back of the photo, a sentence had been written in fine, neat penmanship. "You don't find the way. You remember it." The days after Eliza's vanishing felt both heavier and sharper, as if the air itself had become brittle with implication. Lydia's grief had once come from absence, from silence, but now it was shaped by something far more insidious, knowing that her daughter and the others had not only chosen to disappear, but might still be living that decision somewhere just beyond the reach of reason. While media cycles twisted the narrative into spectacle, media withdrew. She turned off her phone, ignored interview requests, and quietly returned to Montana without telling anyone. The authorities had long since scaled back their efforts, but Lydia didn't need a search warrant or permission. What she needed was a trail. She began where it all had unraveled years ago, Eagle's Rest. The building remained a husk, now half seconded, reclaimed by pine needles and mildew. But she wasn't looking for the past. She was looking for where it had moved. Guided by old GPS logs and fragments of handwritten coordinates she'd once photographed from the bookstore journals, Lydia hiked deeper into the woods than ever before. She moved quietly, alone, every step deliberate. It was on the 5th morning, as dawn filtered weakly through the canopy, that she saw it. At first just a strange arrangement of lichen-covered stones, but as she cleared the debris with her gloves, the full pattern emerged. A circle, precisely laid, each stone no more than 6 inches apart, forming a ring nearly 12 feet in diameter. At its center, charred wood and ash confirmed a fire had been lit not long ago. Around the outer edge, small bundles of dried herbs and twine had been placed at cardinal points. This was not random. It was a ritual space. And it was recent. Lydia crouched, listening to the wind, half expecting footsteps behind her. But there was only stillness. Then she noticed the footprints, light, narrow, pressed deep into the soft soil. They circled the stones and trailed off into the forest. She followed, breath caught in her throat, unsure whether she hoped to find someone or feared it. After 100 paces, she came upon the remnants of a small camp, 2 low tents, a cooking pot nestled in warm coals, and a canvas bundle partially unrolled beside a mossy log. It was so clearly occupied, so clearly alive, that for a moment she froze, terrified she'd be seen. But the camp was empty. Whoever was here had stepped away. She crouched by the fire, brushing away soot. Among the charred wood sat a photograph, socially so turred by the way. Sat her ghost straight away, as if recently warmed in a pocket. Lydia picked it up with trembling hands. The image showed 7 figures standing in a forest clearing, the exact dimensions unclear but the tone unmistakable. They wore robes, dark, hooded, simple. Each stood with their hands clasped in front of them, heads slightly bowed. But it was not the same group from before. Eva was there. Lydia's heart clenched as she recognized her daughter's profile. But beside her stood strangers. 3 of the faces did not match any of the original 7. They were younger, their expressions unreadable. One appeared to be no older than 17. None of them looked at the camera. On the back of the photo, scribbled in black ink, was a date, 3 months ago. Lydia stared at it in disbelief. They had grown. Others had joined. She folded the photograph and tucked it into her coat, heart pounding. Her breath fogged the cold air as she scanned the tree line. What had begun as an attempt to recover the past had now collided with the present, and the present was not frozen in time. It was evolving, spreading, transforming. Lydia rifled through the canvas bundle and found a notebook wrapped in wax cloth. Inside, familiar hand-huntering. It wasn't Eva's, but it carried the same tone, measured, calm, fervent. The pages documented meditation sessions, meal plans, supply rotations. But scattered between these were personal notes, reflections on faith, belonging, detachment from the lower life. One page read, "Each arrival confirms the clarity of the path. They come not because we seek them, but because they remember too." Another, underlined twice, "We do not take, they give themselves." A twig snapped behind her. Lydia froze. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the woods, but saw only stillness, the kind of stillness that listens. She quickly packed the notebook and photograph, leaving everything else untouched, then stepped backward into the brush, retracing her steps as silently as she could. She didn't stop moving until she was nearly a mile from the site, where the fog began to thicken and dusk painted the sky in bruised purples. There, in the growing dark, she allowed herself one breath of disbelief. They were still here, not ghosts, not memories, real people still living in the woods under a belief system that had not only survived scrutiny, but seemed to have thrived in secrecy. And there were new followers. That was the part she couldn't reconcile. Who were these newcomers? How had they found the group? Or they, like Rory, gone looking for something they couldn't name? That night in her cabin, Lydia laid the photo flat beneath a lamp and stared at it for hours. She memorized every shadow, every robe fold, every slanted light. She noted the details, Eva standing slightly apart from the others, her head not clasped but loose, her head tilted ever so slightly toward one of the new faces. Not dominance, not submission, but recognition. As if they had reached a threshold together, the world outside buzzed with theories, but Lydia had seen something else. This was no longer about a single event from years ago. It was about continuity, growth. There was no leader visible in the photo, no Brother Owen, but his absence felt like part of the design. This was no longer his vision, it had become theirs, and the forest, once a place of exile, now pulsed with quiet intention. The photo had shattered any lingering illusion that the story was about a past event. The forest community was not frozen in 2017, it was active, evolving, and Lydia now knew that it wasn't acting alone. The presence of new members raised impossible questions. How were they finding this group? Why hadn't the expansion left a clearer digital footprint? How could something so coordinated remain unseen? These questions consumed Detective Mallon too, who had quietly reopened her own investigation. While the FBI remained focused on the legality of voluntary disappearance, Mallon traced the finances. She followed the only lead left, listed as a financial supporter on the now-defunct Via Lucis brochure, Verity Path Foundation. At the time, it had been described as a community development group focused on spiritual education for at-risk youth. What she found beneath that surface disturbed her. New Path had been shut down 2 years after the group vanished, following a series of unexplained withdrawals and irregular reporting. The board had quietly dissolved, but the tax records showed donations continued for months beyond the closure, funneled not to the church or any known public organization, but to a private, unregistered property trust in Washington state. The paperwork was murky, layers of shell corporations masking the trail, but Mallon persisted. Eventually, the name of the trust surfaced in a legal complaint involving land usage near Spokane. The signatory, Adrian Merritt. The last name hit like a bell. Adrian Merritt had disappeared from public record 2 decades earlier after an incident at St. Ignatius Youth Renewal Center, a religious boarding program in Arizona. At 17, he had been accused of inciting a breakaway group of boys to abandon the compound and live in the nearby desert under their own reformed doctrine. The scandal was buried quickly by the church. No charges, no formal expulsion, only a transfer of oversight. And then Adrian vanished. No schooling records, no employment history, no online presence. Until now. Lydia, informed by Malin's discovery, began tracing Verity Path's legacy from another angle, those who claim to have benefited from its programs. She contacted dozens of former participants, many of whom gave vague, reverent testimonials that echoed the language from the Via Lucis journals. I became unstuck, I shed my identity. They taught me how to hear truth again. One woman, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described attending a pre-retreat training program on a farm in Oregon where participants were instructed in voluntary detachment, induced absence, and a method of self-relinquishment called the fall of name. She claimed they never used legal names, that surnames were considered the final chain, and that once inside, no one could ask about origins, only direction. When shown a photograph of Brother Owen, the woman shook her head. Not him, she said, but the man who came to our training. He called himself A. He never gave more than that. Always said the teacher had been taught too. It was Adrian. Lydia knew it before Malin confirmed the photo match days later using a private facial recognition service. The resemblance was clear, Brother Owen's brother, but with the same eyes. The same gaze that didn't search for connection, but for surrender. The realization unraveled a dangerous implication. Via Lucis was not an isolated incident. It was a continuation, a node in a larger system, a network built on the idea that release from identity was salvation, and that people would, if properly guided, seek it out themselves. Malin uncovered archived meeting notes from a donor conference Verity Path had hosted in 2011. One line stood out, written in the margin of a scream script: "True freedom is not taught, it's remembered. Our role is to create the silence where memory returns." Another document described a facility called The Threshold in northern Utah, rumored to be a prototype for a long-term transformation community, structured isolation, reorientation rituals, identity fasting. The permit had been denied after neighbors protested what they described as religious radicalism under the guise of healing. But funding didn't stop. It was redirected to Montana. Lydia realized then that what she was facing wasn't just a mystery about Eva's fate. It was a philosophy, spreading quietly through rural programs, fronted by organizations that promised growth but delivered dissolution. She couldn't prove the new members in the photo had come from the Threshold, but the timeline fit, and the methods were identical. The emphasis on choice, the erasure of past names, the silence in place of confession. One evening, Lydia sat in the motel room where she had laid out all the maps, photos, journal pages, and documents. She stared at a note she had nearly thrown away weeks earlier, a small folded square found in the shelter's old notebook. Inside, a message in tiny script: "What begins in retreat ends in return." She hadn't understood it then, but now it sounded like a map of intent. The retreats were not destination. They were doors. A knock on her door startled her. She opened it slowly. An envelope sat on the threshold, no name, no stamp. She opened it and found a single sheet of paper with a message typed in the center. "They are not lost. They are listening, and more are ready." Beneath it, a photograph, different from the one she'd found in the camp. This one showed a new group, standing at dusk beneath a Warkin carveway, truth, true silence. Among them were familiar faces, but again, new ones too. Lydia had returned to the forest many times before, always with maps, questions, and a heart full of unfinished pleas. But this time felt different. There was no official search, no team, no permits or escorts, just her, walking softly through the morning mist, following the narrow, nearly invisible trail that she alone knew how to find now. The air was still, almost reverent, and as she reached the perimeter of the old clearing, she saw them. Figures dressed not in the dark robes of the earlier photographs, but in white. The fabric shimmered faintly against the shifting light of the trees, not ceremonial, but clean, minimal, unburdened. They moved without sound, stepping through the earth brush like they belonged to the earth more than to the world. 7. No, 8, she counted carefully. And there, slightly apart from the group, her posture unmistakably familiar, her hair tied back in the same simple knot Lydia had braided for her as a girl, was Eva. Lydia didn't call out, not at first. She just stepped forward until the crunch of the leaves beneath her boots gave her away. The group stopped. Slowly, Eva turned. Her eyes found Lydia's and didn't flinch. No shock, no panic, just a quiet recognition, like seeing something expected. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eva stepped toward her, alone, leaving the others behind, in a semicircle around the old fire pit. Lydia swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, cracked under the weight of all the years. "Eva," she whispered, "please, I need you to come home." Eva's face didn't change. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She reached gently for Lydia's hand and held it between both of hers, warm, real, steady. "Mom," she said softly, "I never left. I just stopped pretending I belonged somewhere else." Lydia's knees weakened, but she held her ground. "You were a child," she whispered. "You were misled, manipulated. I know what they did." Eva shook her head. "No," she said, "you know what you needed to believe so you could survive not understanding." Her grip didn't tighten, but her voice became firmer. "You call this being lost, but to me it was the beginning, the first breath that was really mine." Lydia blinked hard, breath catching. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You'll just stay here? With them?" Eva looked back at the others, then at the trees. "With myself," she said, "with those who see the world without needing to name it." Lydia felt something crack, not in anger, not in despair, but in surrender. A long-held tension loosened in her chest, not healed, not resolved, but acknowledged. She looked around at the circle, at the forest, at the fire pit, still faintly warm. These weren't captives, they were believers, and whether she understood that belief or not, it was real to them. Eva leaned forward and kissed Lydia's forehead gently. "Thank you for looking," she said. "But you don't have to search any more. I'm not hiding." Lydia nodded, just barely. The breath she let out felt like something ancient leaving her lungs. Eva stepped back toward the group. The others waited silently, no one speaking, no one gesturing. They moved as one, turning away from the clearing and heading deeper into the woods, toward a direction Lydia didn't know and would never trace again. She stood there, unmoving, her hands empty, her heart split wide between grief and grace. And for the first time since that day so many years ago, she didn't call her daughter's name. She didn't ask her to stop. She didn't reach out. She simply watched. The white robes disappeared slowly between the trunks, and the last thing Lydia saw was Eva's silhouette, pausing for one heartbeat before vanishing completely into the shadows. The forest returned to stillness, no birdsong, no breeze, just the soft echo of footsteps already fading. Lydia turned, slowly, and began the walk back, not with closure, not with answers, but with something closer to peace. For she now understood what had once felt unforgivable, that sometimes love means letting someone go, even when everything inside you screams to hold on. That sometimes the deepest devotion isn't in rescue, but in release. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more mysteries like this to light. What do you think really happened in those woods? Do you believe Eva truly found peace, or is there something more behind their silence? Tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.